Hello, everybody. My name is Shireen, and I am an IVC student and a member of the Psi Beta Introductory Psychology Peer Teacher Project, and I'll be presenting Lesson 4. So perhaps you have heard or read about the concerns some experts are having about the quality of sleep experienced by teenagers. So many high school students say that they do not obtain the recommended 8.5 to 9.5 hours of sleep each night. Honestly, prior to all of this, I thought it was 7 hours, so maybe some of you guys might even relate. So you might ask yourself what factors influence the quality and the length of teenagers' sleep. So a lot of things can play a role, such as their work schedules, if they're working, the amount of schoolwork, and they might be involved in sports or other extracurricular activities or social activities and like family stuff. Everything can play a role. So sleep researchers are concerned about all of this. And here's a TED Talk that will discuss a little bit more.
It's 6 o'clock in the morning, pitch black outside. My 14-year-old son is fast asleep in his bed, sleeping the reckless, deep sleep of a teenager. I flip on the light and physically shake the poor boy awake, because I know that, like ripping off a Band-Aid, it's better to get it over with quickly. I have a friend who yells fire just to rouse her sleeping teen, and another who got so fed up that she had to dump cold water on her son's head just to get him out of bed. Sound brutal? But perhaps familiar? Every morning I ask myself, how can I, knowing what I know and doing what I do for a living, be doing this to my own son? You see, I'm a sleep researcher. So I know far too much about sleep and the consequences of sleep loss. I know that I'm depriving my son of the sleep he desperately needs as a rapidly growing teenager. I also know that by waking him up hours before his natural biological clock tells him he's ready, I'm literally robbing him of his dreams, the type of sleep most associated with learning, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. But it's not just my kid that's being deprived of sleep. Sleep deprivation among American teenagers is an epidemic. Only about 1 in 10 gets the 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night recommended by sleep scientists and pediatricians. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, phew, we're doing good, my kid's getting 8 hours. Remember, 8 hours is the minimum recommendation. You're barely passing. 8 hours is kind of like getting a C on your report card. There are many factors contributing to this epidemic, but a major factor preventing teens from getting the sleep they need is actually a matter of public policy, not hormones, social lives, or Snapchat. Across the country, many schools are starting around 7:30 a.m. or earlier, despite the fact that major medical organizations recommend that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 a.m. These early start policies have a direct effect on how much, or really how little, sleep American teenagers are getting. They're also pitting teenagers and their parents in a fundamentally unwinnable fight against their own bodies. Around the time of puberty, teenagers experience a delay in their biological clock, which determines when we feel most awake and when we feel most sleepy. This is driven in part by a shift in the release of the hormone melatonin. Teenagers' bodies wait to start releasing melatonin until around 11 p.m., which is 2 hours later than what we see in adults or younger children. This means that waking a teenager up at 6 a.m. is the biological equivalent of waking an adult up at 4 a.m. Now, on the unfortunate days when I have to wake up at 4 a.m., I'm a zombie, functionally useless. I can't think straight. I'm irritable, and I probably shouldn't be driving a car. But this is how many American teenagers feel every single school day. In fact, many of the, shall we say, unpleasant characteristics that we chalk up to being a teenager, moodiness, irritability, laziness, depression, could be a product of chronic sleep deprivation.
All right. So school start times are one factor that might influence teen sleep. If high school starts at an earlier time, then teenagers have to wake up early in order to get there on time. A lot of school districts are starting to take notice of this issue, which is good. Fortunately, psychological research can provide evidence to inform educational policy. Current data on student sleep has motivated districts to consider changing the start time of their schools. But there are some factors that play a role on school districts that they must consider. For example, the time for school sports for school, it's usually early in the morning, and we're kind of thinking that it should be postponed till after the school, but before dark. And a lot of coaches are our biggest opponents because their time is basically the one that is being affected. Also, there's like family schedules that play a role. Like parents have to go to work at an early time and they can't transport their children if the time is changed. And even the families that don't transport their children themselves and use the busing system, most districts use only one set of buses for elementary, middle, and high schools. So if we change the time for high school, it will affect all, which is not really convenient. I'm sure that there's other important considerations as well. We need evidence to support the decisions to make a school change their start time. And this isn't an easy decision, so we have to take everything into consideration. Let's look at one study that was investigated in changing the school's start time. This study used what psychologists call a quasi-experimental design. It's similar to a true experimental design, but the difference is in a true experimental design, we control all other variables in order to know that the independent variable and the manipulation of the independent variable is the one that's causing a change in the dependent variable. And that way we can say that it's a causation. But in a quasi-experimental design, we are not really able to control all the variables either because it's not practical or if it's not ethical. We'll touch some more about that in a bit. People have claimed, based on these data, that the change in sleeps were caused purely by the school starting at a later time. Should we accept that claim? In the actual manipulation, the entire school day was shortened, not just moved back 25 minutes. So what that means is that the school ended at the same time. It just started on later on in the day. So you can think about what conclusions can be made given this specific manipulation. Did you notice that there's no control group? Random assignment of participants to a treatment or a control condition was not possible. We can't tell half of the students, hey, you come earlier on, and the other half to come later on in school time because they all share the same schedule. So they had to start at the same time. So because of this, what researchers did, they compared the outcomes from before the school time was changed, which is time 1%, and they compared it to when they changed the school start time, which is time 2%. This is a good way to compare the data from different times. Some other variables could have co-occurred with the time change. For example, maybe the student's bedtime changed or PE was cut out to make the time change, or some other variables could also play a role. Perhaps students were also told that the reason or what they were measuring was to see whether or not students were less sleepy or if they got more sleepy or if they got more sleep. Could that have led to an expectancy or a placebo effect? That's something to think about. So what challenges do you see for generalizing the findings from this particular study to all high school students? Because remember, this was only done at one school. For example, think about the ways that teenagers at this high school, which is a boarding school, by the way, may differ from students of the same age at other schools and maybe in different high schools in general. If we consider this, that this study was based upon a sample of one high school, to what extent could we generalize the findings from this study to the population of other high schools? Does the sample sufficiently represent the general population of all adolescents? The sample is a single boarding school at which students may have different sleep patterns than the people who live at home because they don't have to commute to school. That's like one of my biggest issue of being late or not having enough sleep is because of my transportation to school. And if in a boarding school, they don't have to transport, so that might have played a big role. The boarding school student may also be more affluent and less racially diverse than the general population. So there's a lot of things to think about. What solutions are available to create a more representative sample in order to generalize? You might think maybe the answer is doing similar studies at different kinds of high schools would be a good start. For example, maybe the next study could be done in a low-income district and compared to a boarding school. Now let's review the study and the answer to the question you were asked a little while ago. So figure 4.1 displays the frequency of scores on one variable, which is the duration of the student's sleep on weeknights. That's the dependent variable. Each row over here is a dependent variable. And just as a reminder, the dependent variable is the variable that we are measuring. So we are measuring whether or not they napped at least sometimes on school days, or whether or not they arrived late to class at least once in the past 2 weeks. We measured whether they struggled to stay awake or fell asleep in class, or if they were too tired to do schoolwork. How likely would the researchers be to get the same results if they were to repeat this study? Now, if you remember in the earlier lessons, a p-value of less than 0.005 means that 95% of the time, if researchers were to repeat the same study, they would find the same results. That's very significant, and that's why they call it a significant result. Can we conclude that the changed school schedule caused student sleep pattern to change? Why or why not? Later in the lesson, we reviewed a true experimental design, which is on driving safety. Participants were randomly assigned to one treatment or the other. For example, the participants in the study, they were randomly assigned to either converse with a passenger or to talk on a cell phone. This is an example of the researcher manipulating the independent variable to see its impact on the dependent variable. And the dependent variable, which is the driving accuracy, it was found to vary as a result of the change in the independent variable. So that's like one of the differences between an experimental and a quasi. Experiment is not being able to control all factors and manipulating the independent variable. The study in the present lesson on school start time, again, is a quasi-experimental study. The quasi-experimental approach can be a very practical way to study behavior, especially when manipulating the independent variable or having a control group is not practical or ethical. In this situation, it was more not practical to do it. In other situations, for example, if there is like, they're trying to measure if like abused pregnant women have deficiency with their children, they can't say, hey, this group of pregnant ladies have to be abused in order to check the differences. So that would not be ethical. So there's different reasons why we would do a quasi-experimental design. So here's a summary of what we have covered so far in the last few slides. That research psychologists use 3 different approaches to study behavior. It might be correlational studies, which is finding the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. A true experimental design, which finds causation, and a quasi-experimental design, which doesn't necessarily rule out causation, but it doesn't also say that it is causation. This is a closing exercise. So try to quickly design a study of a true experiment that tests the impact of late night screen time on sleep. All right, everybody, that ends lesson 4. Lesson 5 will be available soon. Thank you for participating in the lesson and good luck in the future. Thank you.